That's the first prayer.
If you would open your songbook to number 35. 35. We'll sing this before we go to classes after Travis leads us in prayer. 35. Oh, worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing His wonderful love. Our shield and defender, the Ancient of Days, pavilion in splendor and girded with praise. Thy bountiful care, what tongue can recite? It breathes in the air, it shines in the light, it streams from the hills, it descends to the plain, and sweetly distills in the dew and the rain. Frail children of dust, and feeble as frail, in Thee do we trust, nor find Thee to fail. Thy mercies how tender, how firm to the end. Our Maker be tender, a Redeemer and friend. Travis?
Let's pray. Holy Father in heaven, we're very thankful for today, for the good life that you have provided to us, the blessing that it is to be able to gather this morning, to be able to worship, to be able to enter this class this morning. We ask that you would help us to be mindful of the significance of those things that we're about to do, that we would realize that these things are a benefit to our soul, that we would take advantage of them, to be able to use them, to be able to fix those areas in our life that need to be corrected, to be able to grow closer to you. Dear Father, we thank you most of all for Christ, for the love that he has shown for us. We ask you to help us to never forget that. All that in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay.
No, there's a closet on the blue.
I'll hold it for you.
Good morning. As we continue our study on Sermon on the Mount, we started this lesson last week just a little bit about forgiving trespasses. Most of these lessons I find that are obviously lessons that Jesus taught in that day and time are still relevant. They still frequently present themselves as issues that we confront almost daily sometimes. Forgiveness is one of those things that we struggle with a lot of times in many different ways, not only with brothers and sisters, but with those outside the body also. And we as humans, I don't think find this to be a natural course of action, because as humans, forgiveness is not what we normally seek. It's not, and sometimes it's not only the fact that we don't tend to forgive others, but sometimes we don't care what other people like. And sometimes we are the belligerent party. Sometimes we are the one that doesn't act as we should, and sometimes try to be, as Paul said, be at peace with everyone as far as it depends on you, as much as you can. There's limits, and I recognize that. It's difficult in the society we live in, especially because you see the things on TV and hear the things and the reports and the struggles, the conflicts, the different things that are going on. And forgiveness is a part of all this, because forgiveness is a two-way street. But where did forgiveness begin? It didn't begin with me, did it? It's from the Father, because God forgives. And this is one of the things that we struggle with sometimes, is the debt that we owed and the debt that we were forgiven, and sometimes the difficulty we have in dealing with others because of that. We got down to the third question last week. When we fail to forgive, how do we sin against? And then it lists three people or three things. How do we sin when we fail to forgive someone? How do we sin against ourselves? I don't know that I had thought about that exactly in that line or in that light, perhaps. But how do we cheat? How do we sin against? How do we fight against ourselves? Yes, sir?
When we fail to forgive against ourselves, our hearts become hardened. Don't do it at first, it becomes a habit forming. The more you do it, our hearts become hardened, and we lose sight of Jesus' example. And also, it's harmful physically. To be that angry and that upset. There was a point in my life I had a hard time forgiving people that trespassed against myself. And I held grudges, and I can tell you from experience, it's harmful physically. Also, like I said, we lose sight of Jesus' example. What if God never forgave us? We'd be in trouble.
We would be in trouble eternally, wouldn't we? And all of those are valid points. Not only does it hurt us emotionally, but it can hurt us physically. If we harbor that ill will and it haunts us, it bothers us, I think one term said it eats on us. And it does. It literally harms us physically. But all the other issues that you brought up are completely valid also. Yes, sir?
Along with what Marshall said, as far as the hardening of the heart, it affects your attitude. Your attitude about everything, towards others, and, everything that you do and people you come in contact with.
James, take that a step further. As it affects our attitude and affects our relationship with others, what does that do to those relationships?
It deteriorates them.
It harms them. And can you have the proper relationship with someone if you've not forgiven them? But does that not bleed over into your other relationships as well?
Yes, and you can oftentimes that unforgiveness or maybe that deep anger can be taken out on someone else, inadvertently. I mean, you don't mean to, but that's the way, that's what happens.
And sometimes my dissatisfaction with some person may manifest itself over here in my actions towards someone else.
That's right.
And that's exactly right. Eric?
I think right along with that, we're just talking about sinning against ourselves. If we have not forgiven, we sin against, because a lot of times we take it out on others. If we haven't forgiven ourselves, if we've done things that we know we shouldn't have, and we just can't get over it. We just can't get over it. The mental state we're in, we take it out with everybody else too.
It frustrates us, and sometimes it does boil over, if you want to call it that, and you overreact sometimes to something that normally wouldn't bother you. That's exactly right. Buddy?
If they have an unforgiving attitude, it really creates a negative sense in one's personality, to the point that it could be that you never see anything positive in any other aspect of life. If everything, you view everything in a negative kind of way. And if all of these add up, creating the hardening of the heart, it affects our emotions, it affects our character, it affects our personality in a real way.
And the next step to that is, how are we to view the things around us, with a positive or a negative? If we're not looking at them with a positive outlook, there's probably something wrong. But as you said, those other failures can lead to that, can't they? We do.
And ultimately, our forgiveness from God is based on our forgiveness of others. So when we fail to forgive, we're condemning ourselves.
We're jeopardizing ourselves, aren't we? And that might be the most serious of all. Kyle, did you have something?
Yeah, I had a question, more or less. Are we supposed to be forgiving? It talks about it in Matthew 20, in 18:35, forgive your brother. People that are outside of the church that wrong. Let's just say, no offense, Bart. What if you buy a car, you get a used car salesman, he does you bad wrong, or a tractor salesman, or whatever the case may be.
Let's go with tractor sales.
And you no longer have to see that person, deal with that person, be around that person. Is that different than what it's speaking here when it says forgive your brother?
I guess I'll use the example of Christ on the cross, where those people that murdered him, his brothers, that they were certainly not like-minded with him, obviously. But what did he seek? He sought their forgiveness. That doesn't mean they were forgiven of that sin instantly, but he was willing to forgive them personally for the injustice that they had done to him. And this is just my opinion. Yeah, we're supposed to forgive our brothers and sisters, yes. But that can't be limited to just this group. If it is, I think we're going to experience some of the problems that Marshall talked about, and Buddy and James both.
That if it's people that you don't ever see again, and you just end up sweeping it under the rug and just moving on. I just won't deal with that person anymore. Just keep on with it.
And sometimes that's what you have to do, because
A form of forgiveness.
As long as you don't hold a grudge.
if you don't hold a grudge and you don't dwell on it, and you don't, and I think Marshall said, it eats on you. Well, if you're fretting about it and worrying about it and still angry with that person because they sold you a tractor that the PTO didn't work, okay, now you've got a personal issue with that. But if you go get that fixed and you don't worry about it anymore, and you're not going to deal with that person anymore, I think you can go ahead with the forgiveness that you should. And I think that's what Christ expects us to do. I want to get back to what Buddy said just now. If we're not careful, we'll let those instances and some of the things that Marshall was talking about and some of the others, it impacts us personally. It impacts our personality. It impacts how we deal with other people in all situations. And we can allow ourselves to be negative about everything and not find anything good in the good things around us. If you look, you can find something wrong with nearly anything, but you can also find some good things if you're looking with that perspective. And I don't mean you have to be unrealistic and put on rose-colored glasses and just ignore all of those things, but you have to be careful, and you have to monitor your own attitude and think about it. Betty, did you have something else?
In regards to his question, forgiveness is a product of love. And Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, they asked him, who is our neighbor? Well, Jesus illustrates everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in the world is my neighbor, and I am to have an attitude of love towards them, and that love is defined by Paul in 1 Corinthians. So even if the car salesman gets us and does something against us, we must continue to have an attitude of forgiveness. If we love our neighbor as we love ourselves, it's not gonna be difficult for us to be forgiving, even if we don't ever have any other dealings with them. If we happen to see them again, obviously, we're not going to be bitter, we're not going to be angry, we're going to have that attitude of forgiveness, and it's a product of love, and we're commanded to love everybody.
Mm-hmm. As Christ did. I think that's exactly right. Yes, sir?
I think along the same lines in Romans 5, where that God demonstrated his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So we weren't Christians. The forgiveness was offered to us through Christ. Not everybody takes advantage of that. And I think it's the same dealing with people. We have to offer that forgiveness. Now, whether they accept it and change their ways and do what's needed, that's not on our end. But if we're harboring that and we're saying, I won't ever forgive that person, whoever it is, then I think it's like, buddy, we don't have the proper love for them, because us forgiving them and moving on might make them realize, something different about him. He's not still mad at me over this.
Exactly.
There are some things we have no control over. The things that we do and say, who controls them?
We do.
And not only do we control them, we're responsible for them.
That's right. Good point.
And that's part of the forgiveness. Let's go to the next part of that. How do we sin against others when we fail to forgive? And we talked about this a little bit. What are we depriving that other person of?
Christian influence.
The Christian influence is probably the most important thing we deprive them from. Have you thought about the fact that the mercy that you were showed, what are you supposed to do with that? You're supposed to extend that to others. You're supposed to show that to others. If you don't forgive them, have you done that? Have you offered them the same opportunity that you had for forgiveness? And when you fail to forgive them, does it hurt you more or them? If it hurts us both, but it may hurt me more, as Marshall said, it can physically work on you, emotionally, mentally. It can bother you to the point that you have a lot of other problems. And it can impact your life to the point that it impacts your dealings with others. And how you look at and deal with other people is how important. And go back to Kyle's question, is it just the people in this building that I should behave with? Or should I be mindful of my Christian influence with everyone? I think that's the responsibility that we have, buddy.
Our greatest responsibility as God's people is to spread the gospel to those who are lost. That's what we're called to do. And if we were bitter and angry and unforgiving towards people, there's no chance in the world that they're ever going to listen to us or see in us an example or hear the words of the truth and accept them. So it just goes against the idea of being the kind of Christian that we should be, shining the light that Jesus says that we're supposed to shine. When we are unforgiving, as Jesus said, we put the basket over the candle. People are not seeing Christ in us. And if they don't see Christ in us, we have no chance of converting them.
We may lose untold opportunities because of our attitude and because of how we deal with people.
And it's not just the one individual that we don't forgive, because they're going to tell other people about us or our attitude. And so the influence is going to grow. It's not just between two people. It could be between a lot of people.
And this is kind of human nature. If somebody helps me and does a kind deed towards me, will I remember it? Probably. If somebody does me a disservice and cheats me or does something like that, will I remember that? Most people remember that, absolutely. If they remember either one, it's going to be the negative side. They're more likely to harbor on that and remember on that. The last question, how do we sin against God?
Disobeying his command.
That was my first answer, disobedience. Because what does he not only want us to do, what does he command us to do? To forgive how, Eric?
As he forgave us.
As he forgave us. And I think that's the key how did he forgive us?
There was no conditions other than to obey.
Completely, and there are conditions, and if we are willing to be obedient and meet those conditions, how complete is our forgiveness? It's absolutely.
Our sin as far away from God as the east is from the west. The Old Testament speaks to it. He completely forgets it. He writes it out of his book of remembrance. Now, we're probably not capable of doing that. I'm just saying that probably is one thing man cannot do. Now, we might try, but I mean, God has no memory of our sin when he forgives us. And that's what we should strive to do.
Do we sometimes struggle to forgive ourselves? And I think that's one of the problems that we deal with, is because God forgives completely. It's obliterated, it's gone. But do we forgive sometimes, and do we forgive ourselves for the things that we have said or done, or failed to say or do? And I think that's where we struggle sometimes, is recognizing our imperfections and forgiving and moving on from that. Travis, did you have something?
When we talk about this idea of, holding a grudge or failing to forgive, all those things happen in the past. Those are things that we hold on to. Well, if we're focused on those things, whether it's on ourselves or something somebody did against us, God wants us to be forward-thinking people. Right? We're supposed to have that hope that it talks about, thinking about those things that come, thinking about eternity in heaven. But if we spend our time focused on those things of the past, those things that we're holding on to, I don't think there's any train of thought that we can realize, well, I'm going to hold this grudge, but I'm also thinking about eternity with God. Like, those are two separate sentences that we try to put as much distance between as possible. But if we really think about that, we hurt ourselves, others, our relationship with God. When we hold on to those things, we're really spending our time and our focus on something that happened in the past, not thinking about how do we move forward with God.
I think that's one of our greatest commands. It is to look forward to what? To his second coming. And your point's a good one. If we're looking backward and living in those wrongs and those injustices, and the other side of that coin is everything you consider to be an injustice or a wrong actually so? We, as human beings, we look at that through tainted eyes sometimes, don't we? Because looking from our perspective, we may consider that to be wrong or an injustice, but the other person considered it normal, maybe. So we have to be careful with that too, but your point's a good one. We are supposed to look forward and live for what's coming. We have to live in today, but we have to look forward to what's coming also. Next question. Andy, would you read Matthew 18:23 through 35, please, sir?
Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold, with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, "Have patience with me, I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when the same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seized him. He began to choke him, saying, "Pay me what you owe." And so his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, and "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." He refused and went to put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. And then his master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you pled with me, and should not you have mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart.
And the last verse sums it up, but I want to talk about the others that lead up to that just a little bit. And the first thing you notice is the contrast of the size of the two debts. And the first debt, and one, and I don't know how to do a monetary exchange on this with the values that they gave there. One said it was $10 million worth of, versus $20. And I don't know if that's accurate or not, but you can tell from the writing, whether you know the exact conversion or not, that one was huge, one was hopeless. One of the places I read said that debt, no matter how long that man lived and how hard he worked, he could never repay it. It was a hopeless debt. The other one was not a hopeless debt. It could have been taken care of, but the size and the contrast between the two is one of the first things that we get. And the fact that one of them was hopeless and one of them actually was achievable if everything had worked according to his plan or his thought or his desire. The other one was that how much did the first servant, how much was he forgiven? Was it just a part of it? It was complete. It was total, wasn't it? Did he think there were any strings attached to it? The king didn't say anything about any strings attached to it, did he? He forgave him and he said, go your way. And he allowed him to basically write that debt off and not be concerned with it anymore. Not worry about it, not let it bother him. Live his life and not let that hang over him for the rest of his life. Now, when the second servant came to him and begged for forgiveness, his attitude was what? He asked for the same forgiveness, didn't he? He asked to be forgiven a debt that was difficult for him. Possibly it was possible that he could have controlled it or taken care of it, but it was difficult because he hadn't repaid it. And what did this first servant do to him? He didn't show any compassion or any mercy or anything else. He was very hard, wasn't he? Now, did he remember the hopelessness or the helplessness that he had versus this other man when he was dealing with him? Obviously not. Where do we fit into this parable as individuals? How big a debt do we owe? Is it anything that we can ever repay, no matter how long we live or how hard we work? We can't. It's just not possible. We are just as hopeless and just as helpless as that man was, weren't we?
And we add to the debt every day.
It's an ongoing debt, isn't it? I hadn't thought about that, Weta, but that's exactly right. If we were honest with ourselves, do we go through a day that we don't add to that debt?
And that forgiveness is always.
But the forgiveness is constant, isn't it? It's not just what I did in the past. It's what I do every day for however many days the Lord gives me. The problem is the first man didn't recognize the mercy that he had received. I'm going to say he didn't appreciate it. And because he didn't appreciate it, how did he act and how did he react with someone that had done him an injustice or a disservice? Now, what's the lesson here for us? How big a debt have we been relieved of, forgiven of? And Buddy's words were excellent because it's wiped completely away. It's not still on the books just in case. It's gone. Now, when someone does a sin against us, how do we react? And see, that's the contrast, the size of the debts, but the contrast of how the people reacted. And this is the struggle that we have, and that's one of the problems that we just spoke of. We have this problem every day, don't we? we struggle with this and other things every day. And as Marshall said a while ago, if we're not careful, it can consume us. It can come to the point that that's all we worry about is someone maybe recently, maybe in the far past, that did something that we didn't like, that maybe it hurt us financially. Maybe, as Kyle said, they sold us a piece of equipment or a car or something else that cost us money because it wasn't what it was supposed to be. But when we look at the forgiveness that we've received versus the forgiveness that we should offer to others, how should we compare those? How do we compare those? Maybe that's the question.
Most of the time we don't.
Well,
We fail to. We fail to bring to mind the forgiveness that God has given us. And I think that's the lesson that Jesus said. If we're going to develop a forgiving heart, we must remember the forgiveness that God has given us.
mm-hmm. And he reinforces that so many times in his teachings in various ways. But and verse 35 said, you must forgive. Where does that say you must forgive them? From your heart. That's not just lip service, is it? And see, I think we get in trouble sometimes. I don't worry about it. Go on. But do we really forgive sometimes? Even though we say that, do we forgive them from the heart? Andy?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Jesus is saying this is a heart issue in this case because he says at the very end, wraps it up with, you've got to forgive your brother from your heart. The servant that had this huge debt forgiven, he should have gone away completely humble, completely thankful, but instead he goes and finds somebody and chokes him. I mean, there was obviously there was no effect on his heart, apparently, from what happened. If we do that to a brother or sister, then we ignore that same forgiveness from God.
And we're just as guilty as he was, weren't we? If we react that way and or mistreat or abuse someone else that way, as he did his fellow servant. But it is, as Jesus said, it is a hard issue. And it is not necessarily something that is natural. It's not necessarily something that's easy. Most of the people in this room are more mature. Does it get easier as we mature?
Well, yeah, because as you get older, you forget. It does get easier.
There's a lot of truth in that, buddy. Sadly, that is correct. But in the immediate, I guess I should say, it should get easier, shouldn't it? Is it always, though? It's not always. It should be, but it's not always. Just because we age, do we lose our emotions? And that's what gets us in trouble a lot of times. Eric?
I think a lot of that, looking at how we react to things as we get older, is how we've trained our heart in our younger years. You're not just going to flip a switch because you get older and all of a sudden it starts to become more forgiving.
Mm-hmm.
It's how we condition our heart. How are we trying to live like Christ? Are we trying to follow His example each day? Then the longer we do that, the easier it should get. Doesn't mean there's going to be less times to forgive others as we get older. There's still going to be problems. But if we've conditioned our heart right and are truly trying to emulate Christ, I do believe it will get easier.
Does gray hair necessarily equate with maturity or wisdom?
Not always.
Not always. It may be forgetfulness, but we do.
Well, you know, we have this thought sometimes whether we say it or not. Well, I'm going to forgive you for this, but you better not do it again. And I'm just thinking, oh, I hope God doesn't take that attitude.
Because sadly enough, sometimes we do repeat the same mistakes, don't we? And I've heard people say that.
You better not do it.
Don't do that again. But if Christ died for me, is that what he did? It's complete, it's total, it's absolute, and I'm going to use Betty's phrase again. Not only does God eliminate that, he forgets it. He does not hold that back and say, okay, you did this again, here we go. No, that's not the way it works. And we're human, and we're not ever going to be perfect like God is and able to do that, but we should strive for that. And I think that's what Eric was talking about. As we deal with more people and as we age and hopefully mature and gain some wisdom, these are the things that we train our heart to do. And as Andy said, it's a matter of the heart. It has to start with our heart, because if it doesn't, what's up here is never going to be right. It has to come from here, because my human side, my emotions, boy, they kick in instantly. And if there's not any control on them, if I don't have them in check, that's when we get in trouble. Andy, did I see, or Travis, what?
You know, we focus on the disparity in the size of the debt a lot in this, but the response, or I guess the statement made by both of the guys doing the pleading was exactly the same. It says, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Patience plays a huge piece in that. We may not all be good with patience, but we all understand what it is. And having patience with somebody or ourselves, whatever it is, when we're having to forgive, there's a lot of patience that has to be taken. We have to sit and take that real deep breath, because it's not about, well, I'm going to do this, but don't do it again. You know, or we got to do the patience that's required there. I think that's why that it's illustrated that way. Have patience with me, I will pay you off. It's not a, well, here's my plan to pay you back. Here's my plan to fix it. Have patience with me, I will pay you off. We have that mindset of, you know what, I'm gonna have to extend patience when someone is asking me to forgive them. When I have to extend that forgiveness, there's a lot of patience that sometimes we want, well, only when it's easy. Only when I can see that they're not going to do it again. I see their plan to correct it and to fix it, to make sure it doesn't happen again. That's not how it's laid out. Have patience with me, I will pay you.
Patience certainly enters into that. Does I'm not sure how to say this exactly, does the attitude of the other person enter into it? Do we sometimes allow ourselves to get tripped up because of the other person's arrogance or unwillingness to yield, and sometimes unwillingness to acknowledge that they've done something wrong?
Whether they deserve it or not is how we kind of judge that. Well, they don't deserve forgiveness.
Oh man, now boy, you're getting hard now. Whether they deserve it or not. Did we deserve? Are we, or will we ever be deserving? And see, this is the mindset that Eric's talking about, and the training that we need to try to do. Is it easy? Does it come naturally? No. Will it ever? Maybe it'll be easier, but it's not ever going to be natural, because that's just not human nature to be forgiving. Yes, sir?
I think one thing that sometimes we lose sight of, you can forgive someone, it doesn't mean that from that point forward, you just gotta blindly trust that they'll never do it to you again. If someone truly takes advantage of you, you owe it to them to forgive them. But the part of that wisdom comes in that you don't just open up and let them do it again.
And this is what we struggle with sometimes. And one of the questions, I can forgive but not forget. Are we supposed to forget? We don't hold it against them, we forgive them, but do we forget what they did or how they did things and allow them to continue to do that same thing wrong? And this is difficult, because if you don't forget it as God forgets and obliterates it, then we have to be careful, because we want to dredge that back up again.
Well, I think like was said a while ago, that forgiveness, you line into, if you truly forgive them, you're not gonna dwell on it daily. That's that forget it.
Mhm.
You're not gonna dwell on it, you're not gonna let it eat on you, you're gonna move on. But if the situation arises again, I think you're gonna call to remembrance how it happened before and make sure that it doesn't happen again. I think you should. But it's that idea of dwelling on it daily, where, like Marshall said, where it just eats at you, that's all you're concerned with. You can't do that.
I think the answer may be we can't allow that to control us.
Correct.
And we can't allow that to control our actions, even with that person, but we certainly can't allow it to control our actions with others. Nick?
Whether it's forgiving yourself or forgiving someone else, you cannot move forward until you forgive yourself or whatever it is. In Christianity, is all about moving forward, not looking backward to the things that has affected your life or affected you, looking forward. That's the Apostle Paul, probably one of the greater examples of he held vengeance or unforgiveness for the people, things that have been done to him, he never passed on.
And that's exactly right. And that's a perfect example, because we can't look backwards. We're always supposed to be looking forward. We're always supposed to be anticipating what's coming and be looking forward to that rather than dwelling on an injustice. And
Well, like Nick said too, if Paul could have kept looking back to all he did before, if he hadn't forgiven himself for all that he did to persecute the church, he couldn't have moved forward. He had to forgive himself.
And not only did he have to forgive himself, but what about all those people that had done terrible disservices and injustices to him after he was converted, that were his allies before, but now were his enemies? He not only had to forgive himself, which may have been the most difficult, but he had to forgive them too. But that is moving forward. I think that's required of us. Okay, in his model prayer, in this question number 5, Jesus makes our forgiveness dependent on what? Forgive us our debts as we forgive others. And he says it again at the end, that if we don't forgive others, what's going to happen to us? We're not going to expect, we should not expect to be forgiven. How emphatic is that, and how universal is that? Maybe that's the way to say it. If I'm not willing to forgive, if I'm not willing to to move forward, and what Nick said is exactly right, if I don't let go of it, I can't move forward. I have to let go, I have to move forward, I have to be looking forward. If I don't do that, what's that going to do to the others? But maybe more importantly, what's it going to do to me? How does that impact me? What can I expect from God if I've not been forgiving? And this is where it gets hard, this is where it hits home. Because if I'm not willing to forgive, what can I expect from God? The same thing. I cannot expect him to forgive me if what? If I'm not willing to be forgiving, if I'm not willing to let some of those things go, if I'm not willing to do what Christ said here and in other places, and not, as I said, it's got to be from the heart. It's got to be sincere and genuine. And I think that's one of the problems that we deal with, one of the struggles that we deal with is forgiveness on the surface is one thing, and it may look pretty good, but do we, and sometimes there's not anybody knows this but me, do I really forgive them? Do I do as we've been taught to do?
I'm a firm believer in forgetting it. Not just forgetting it for forgetting it. I think if you can't forget it, you really haven't forgiven it. That's my personal opinion.
And you have to keep moving forward, don't you?
Because if you wake up at night remembering a situation, then you go to talk about thinking about how to get back, how to get even.
Yeah, and obviously that's wrong.
You're wanting to get even, you haven't
You haven't forgiven or forgotten, that's right. Thank y'all for your comments this morning.